Welcome to today's National Ethnic Media News Briefing. I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services and your moderator today. Today's briefing focuses on the debt ceiling crisis. Many experts believe that this was one of the most dangerous and maybe even futile standoffs on raising the debt ceiling that the US government has engaged in. An agreement was struck, as we all know, between the White House and the Republican leadership, and Congress got the last word and confirmed the deal. The process and the results raise many questions. Is there a better way to do things? Will the resulting budget cuts and spending caps help or hurt the economy? Why are some adults, particularly poor and older adults, the losers in this scenario? And is this the end of the moratorium on college loan repayments? Is there any sign of a positive return to bipartisan deal-making despite deeply polarized politics? We have asked the experts on today's panel to discuss these issues and address your questions. Many of us know little about this topic. I'm a case study in someone who really badly needs an unpacking. So today is a welcome learning opportunity for us to share what we learned with our audiences. Our speakers today include Rachel Snyderman, Senior Associate Director, Business and Economic Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington. Shannon Buckingham, Senior Vice President for Communications and Senior Counselor at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Lindsay Owens, PhD, Executive Director for the Groundwork Collaborative. We ask our speakers to speak slowly, as I'm doing, for our interpreters in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean. And we ask reporters, please enter questions in the chat box. And speakers, if you could, monitor the chat and respond as you see fit. People really love reading comments in the chat. We will send contact information for each of our speakers and the organizations they work with, as well as a recording of the briefing, so everyone has a good grasp of these folks as sources for potential future reference. We are also live streaming this event and posting video excerpts on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. We begin with Rachel Snyderman, who will share her perspectives about the deal, whether it signals a return despite the polarization to bipartisan deal-making, and what her agency thinks can be done to reform the debt ceiling resolution process. Thank you, Ms. Snyderman, for joining us.
Thank you, Sandy, so much for having me. It's wonderful to join Shannon and Lindsay today, and all of you. Look forward to talking a bit more and diving into this debt limit debate where we find ourselves time and time again over the past years, and to answer any questions that you may have. So first, I just want to start with a bit of context about what the Bipartisan Policy Center is. We are a Washington, D.C. think tank that was founded in 2007 by a group of 4 bipartisan senators who really were looking, once they left the Senate, for an opportunity to engage and drive forward policy solutions that reflect the ideas and values of both parties. I think that it is a telling sign in today's political climate that we are the only organization within Washington, D.C. that has the name bipartisan in our business title. And so I think that that reflects that not only are we in a very polarized time when it comes to our politics and our policy making, but also that there is a tremendous need for bipartisanship. This is hard work. And to give a bit more context about why I'm here speaking about the debt limit, since 2011, BPC, the Bipartisan Policy Center, has been a leading voice in providing objective analysis on the debt limit to policymakers and the public to really make sense of what it means, what the debt limit is, what flirting with default costs, not only if we were to actually default on our debt and our financial obligations, but to signify to policymakers that even just having these recurring debates and political brinkmanship surrounding the debt limit yields true costs to American taxpayers, the global economy. And so we have worked each debt limit episode to provide that objective analysis as to what these costs look like, but to also estimate for lawmakers, give an independent look as to when that default date could be. So we have seen over the past months that Secretary Yellen has provided an estimate to Congress as to when she feels that she may find herself in a position where the Treasury Department will no longer be able to make good on its obligations. And we kind of in our shop do the same thing, kind of crunch those numbers every single day, trying to estimate the millions of payments that are going in and out of the federal government on a daily basis. And so we have been doing that over the past months and have been helping to drive to drive the point that in a time of divided government, the only solution that was going to come out of these negotiations was going to have to be a bipartisan agreement. When the United States hit its statutory debt limit back in January, the Secretary Yellen immediately began deploying some administrative accounting procedures that are legally available to her so that we could operate under the debt limit for some time while lawmakers sort out their negotiations. And so we saw over the past months that the Biden administration and Democrats were very clear on their position that they wanted to pass a clean debt limit increase, as has been done before, and also has not been done before. As we've found ourselves in negotiations as well. Whereas on the other side of the political aisle, we saw Republicans not wanting to agree to a clean debt limit increase, but instead that it would have to come with some sort of fiscal restructuring package or discussion, debate, and ultimately legislation surrounding curbing our spending. And so it really was in the past few weeks where we saw both parties really enter that negotiating room with their list of priorities, and over the past few weeks kind of narrow down where those priorities overlapped. And so I think that the final bill, the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023, it reflects the hard work of compromise, that bipartisanship is not going to please everyone, but it will please the majority. And so I know that we're going to dive into some of the specifics of the legislation with Lindsay and with Shannon, but I think at a high level, it's reflecting the gives and takes of some of the top priorities that we saw coming out of the Republicans, such as implementing caps on discretionary spending, implementing some new work requirements surrounding federal public assistance programs. But then also it is in line with Democratic priorities, expanding access to some of those programs, and as well as first and foremost, making sure that we are not defaulting on our debt. And I think we can dive in a bit more to some of those other priorities that are in the bill that satisfy both parties. We also saw kind of reflected in the final vote counts that both sides of the aisle were able to bring their caucuses to the table. We saw, I mean, especially in the House of Representatives, more Democrats support this bill than Republicans. And we also saw that reflected in the final numbers in the Senate as well. And so I do think that while, you know, we'll dive into the specifics of like where there are winners and losers, and that can obviously be a subjective exercise as well. You know, I think that it does show that Washington is not necessarily broken, but that Washington also does love 11th hour deals. And so I think that, you know, especially here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, while we applaud Congress's willingness to avoid default, I think it is important to note that this legislation leaves off some key areas that we want to see bipartisan reform happen. I think first and foremost that the bill only targets discretionary spending. We're not talking about some of the programs like Social Security, like Medicare, you know, the largest cost drivers of our budget. Not necessarily saying we need to cut those programs, but we know that we need to reform them. We know that we need to strengthen them so that they remain solvent for the individuals who will rely on them in just the next decade. The bill also fails to look at new sources of revenue generation. We have to be serious about raising revenue through the tax code. We are now averaging annual $1 trillion deficits. And the bill really does nothing to look at the revenue side of the equation. And so I think that it is time that lawmakers come together to focus on solutions that can also raise revenues instead of just allowing taxes to be cut and to really only focus on a increasingly smaller share of the fiscal pie, which is this discretionary spending, which is really only about, you know, a quarter of the budget. I'll also just note that I think as we kind of talk and think about, you know, whether is this showcasing a new dawn, a new era for bipartisan policymaking, you know, it's important to note that before the past decade, addressing the debt limit was done in a bipartisan manner, passed or increased by Congresses and administrations of both parties multiple times. It's really over the past 10 years that we have seen political brinkmanship surrounding the debt limit intensify. And I think that that's the result of course, you know, just this aggregate increased politicization of our political climate. But two, we've started to see the debt limit be kind of the hostage taking device. It's the only time where both parties come together to have fruitful, meaningful discussions about fiscal policy. And I think a lot of that is reflecting the fact that the budget process needs reform, but also the fact that the debt limit really reflects that both parties are responsible for arriving at where we are in our fiscal with our fiscal outlook. It's the result of tax cuts and spending increases that have been implemented by both parties over the past years. There's not one party to blame or one administration to blame. It's a collective effort based on the policies of the past that have been implemented. And so I do think that it does indicate that it's time to kind of rethink how we go about the debt limit and the budget process, because this current system is not working. The last time we were here was in the end of 2021, when the debt limit was raised not once, but twice. And again, in 11th hour deal making that held up the full faith and credit of the United States so that, you know, both parties could seek some sort of resolution. And so this is where our work at the Bipartisan Policy Center has really focused on the fact that there has just got to be a better way. As the holder of the world's reserve currency, as the largest economy, we can't be flirting with default every few years purely based on political motives. We have access to capital markets. We can borrow with great ease. Global investors want to hold our debt. But if we are making a political calculation not to do good by our investors and pay our bills in full and on time, that would be a purely political decision. And so there is legislation that was passed in the last Congress called the Responsible Budgeting Act. That was introduced I'm sorry, not passed. It was introduced in the last Congress in the House of Representatives that would really look to de-risk the debt limit once and for all by tying it more closely to the budget process. And really introducing kind of a new checks and balance system whereby Congress, if they were to pass a fiscally responsible budget resolution, would automatically suspend the debt limit through the next year. If Congress failed to do so, the president would have the authority to request of Congress a suspension of the debt limit if we were within 60 days of hitting the debt limit. And that process would trigger an automatic debate and discussion of our fiscal priorities and fiscal solutions in both chambers of Congress. And that then would yield an opportunity for us to have these real debates and discussions about our way forward. It's no secret that both parties recognize that we have a significant fiscal challenge ahead of us. The interest on our debt is going to outpace our spending on Medicaid next year. It's going to become the largest federal expenditure within the next 30 years. That is tremendous. And I think that as we think about these large numbers, what does a $31 trillion debt even mean? I think it's more important to kind of think about it in the context of what that spending crowds out. If our interest costs soon become our largest government program, what are we sacrificing in its absence? Are we not funding critical social programs that millions of American families rely on? Spending for defense and our military and foreign aid, investments in clean energy and education. So I think obviously, of course, the list goes on, but as our interest costs start to amount, it really is, and especially in a time of rising interest rates, it really is a signal to lawmakers that it's time to act now. And I think that this legislation, while it's not perfect, it reflects the bricks and the bones of priorities that both parties can agree on. It really should be a starting point for future discussions.
Thank you, Rachel. I didn't want to stop you because it was so important to understand points you've made, like what we're facing with $31 trillion debt, what that in itself means and why it's so important to reform this process. Mm-hmm. We have time for just 2 questions. I'll start with a question that is more political than economic, and that is we felt that there were real extremist perspectives on this, and yet realizing that GOP extremists like Marjorie Taylor Greene actually wound up moving towards a more conciliatory position. What do you think triggered that willingness to give up the extreme? How do we understand that?
Yeah, so I think it's an excellent question. I mean, I am certainly, I'm a policy person, not a politics person. So I assume that there is, some negotiation within parties, within caucuses of parties as to, the providing cover for some individuals who didn't want to vote on the legislation. I would assume that, given the fact that the legislation did include, a number of kind of some of those priorities that the Republicans walked in on with, such as, introducing some new work requirements, maybe it was particular elements of the bill that folks support strongly than, more strongly than others, which causes a yes vote or no vote. But I think that there's I wish I had a crystal ball to know, because I was even surprised to see where some of the folks in the Senate ended up voting as well. So I think a lot of it is just the backdoor deals.
Did Trump take a position on this deal?
So I don't know specifically on, I know that everything I read, that there were conversations between Speaker McCarthy and President Trump. I know that there was a lot of worry over the past 2 weeks or even probably more than that, when President Trump had come out and said that the default would be okay. But I think it's important to note that the debt limit was raised 3 times while President Trump was in office on a bipartisan basis. So, all of that to say, I think while he was president, upholding the full faith and credit of the United States was an important objective. And here we are again.
Great. And I'd like to ask Henrietta Burrows of East Palo Alto to ask your question.
Thanks, Sandy. Rachel, in talking about the areas that were not covered by the legislation, you mentioned that raising revenues was one of them. So what are the possibilities of increasing government revenues other than raising taxes?
So, I think that it's a really good question. I think that this is really where it's talking about just some of those policies that incentivize and boost economic growth. So I think that, for example, that's where we saw, a real bipartisan effort on energy permitting reform to be included, to fast track some of these infrastructure projects that bring investment and create jobs. But I also think what's missing from the conversation, it's not missing, it's very much still part of the political calculus, is that we really need to talk about immigration. And obviously, of course, that's indirectly a source of new tax revenue, but it's not, I don't think that we are in the space where we're going to be talking about, increasing tax, especially in divided government, increasing taxes. I think we have to be talking about kind of some of those new sources of tax revenues. And so I think immigration is part of that as well.
Okay, well, please stay with us. We'll come back to more questions. Thank you so much for your opening overview. Our next speaker is Shannon Buckingham of the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, who will share the center's views on the agreement reached and why the center objects so strongly to its new work requirements for receiving some benefits. Shannon, please share your thoughts with us.
Thanks so much, Sandy. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Shannon Buckingham. I'm Senior Vice President for Communications at the Center on Budget. We're a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit, nonpartisan policy research institute. We work on policy at both the federal and state level. I just want to say thanks for the opportunity to join today, and it's great to be part of this conversation with Rachel and Lindsay as well. So the center engaged deeply in the debate over the debt ceiling and the agreement that just passed, because the outcomes of those debates have such profound implications for people across the country, especially people who need support to make ends meet and who we want to ensure have the resources to thrive and to share in this country's prosperity. So let me just briefly start with the implications of default before I turn to the agreement itself, because I think it's important to take note of how high the stakes are in these debt ceiling standoffs. So first, we know that if an agreement wasn't reached and the nation defaulted, that would have had widespread negative effects on the economy as a whole and on people across the country. But we know those effects would have been felt deeply, very deeply by people who are the least economically secure. So just a few examples: 65 million Social Security beneficiaries could have seen their benefits delayed. 6 million veterans and their survivors could have had their benefits held up. Families could have seen their monthly rental assistance, food assistance, childcare delayed. And that's just a few of many examples. And these are supports that people at the lower end of the income scale really count on. If default had extended on, we could have seen, millions of jobs lost, seen a spike in unemployment, and that often hits low-income communities and disproportionately hits Black and Latino communities very hard. So the stakes were really high here. And so let me turn to the agreement. And I just want to say first that even though it was critical to avoid default, it was also wrong of House Republicans to use the debt ceiling as a hostage to force deeply unpopular and harmful policies that they could not pass when they held full control of Congress. So we saw the extreme nature of their demands in the bill that they passed a few weeks ago. Fortunately, the ultimate agreement that was reached avoided much of the damage that that bill would have inflicted. So it's important to note that the deal is a significant improvement over that House bill, but it still has some troubling implications for people who struggle to make ends meet. So I want to talk a little bit more about our concerns about that agreement itself. As Sandy referenced, I think most concerning is a provision that will put SNAP food assistance at risk for very low income older adults through a bureaucratic work reporting requirement. So this policy is already in place for other adults in SNAP. It extends the age limit for that requirement to a group of people age 50 to 54. And this policy will increase hunger and poverty among that group without boosting employment, and just runs contrary to the values that our nation holds.
Shannon, could you just say briefly what SNAP is?
Sure, sorry. It's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It's formerly called food stamps. So it provides monthly benefits to millions of people across the country, kids, seniors, people with disabilities, and low-income working people, to help them ensure they can put adequate food on the table. So, so thanks for that, Sandy. And so this extended this requirement that folks between the ages of 50 and 54 prove regularly that they are meeting a work requirement. So it's a lot of paperwork people have to file to show that they're complying. And I think one of the really difficult things about applying this requirement to people in this age group is that many of them are in poor health. Many low-income adults in this age range are in poor health. And as a result, they can't necessarily do the number of hours or perhaps the physically demanding jobs that they've had throughout their careers. And so many will lose the basic assistance that they count on to buy groceries because they can't meet this work reporting requirement. And the exemption system that is in place that's supposed to kind of screen out people who have health challenges or other reasons for not needing to comply with the requirement is just notoriously laden with red tape and just doesn't work. So it's a really troubling provision that we're deeply concerned about. At the same time, under the agreement, veterans and people experiencing homelessness, along with children aging out of the foster system, can be exempted from these work reporting requirements now. So that was a positive provision that was gained during the negotiations that relies on states to be able to properly identify that folks meet that criteria. And that's a good policy, but I think we think it's important that we shouldn't have to trade off harming one group to help another. So the impact on the 50 to 54-year-olds is very concerning. And then I'll just talk about a couple of other concerns we have about the agreement. There are some problematic provisions related to the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, or TANF, which provides income support to some very low income families with children. The agreement ratchets up requirements on states to show that parents receiving TANF are meeting rigid work requirements. And these are requirements that are just often really ill-suited to the needs of families who are being served by the program. It's really counterproductive that we're doubling down on these failed policies. State officials from red and blue states alike have agreed that these requirements really make it harder for them to meet the needs of very low income families. And we also know that the benefits these kids are getting when their parents get income support are just critical both to their long-term, short-term and long-term well-being. Another concern is that the agreement cuts the part of the budget called non-defense discretionary funding that funds a range of national priorities. So anything from childcare, education, job training, housing, to medical research, environmental protection, food safety, and like dozens and dozens more important funding areas. And these are investments that are really key building blocks of our economy and critical for the well-being of people and communities. So the cuts in these areas are, far less deep than those in the original House Republican bill, but again, still troubling. And, while we always expect a divided government to be negotiating over budgets and spending, we just shouldn't be having these negotiations under the threat of default. So the last point, I think also one Rachel raised, is that the one thing really being left out here, one key thing being left out are revenues. So House Republicans refuse to consider raising revenues even from the wealthiest households and corporations as part of an agreement. I think that raises questions in terms of, it suggests that this really isn't about deficit reduction. And I think particularly the work requirement proposals, which save very little money, also suggest this isn't about deficit reduction. And in fact, the agreement cuts IRS funding that would raise revenue by reining in wealthy tax cheats. So another just concerning provision that made it into the ultimate agreement. So where does that leave us? So first, as I think we've all agreed already, we've taken the threat of default off the table for an extended period. That's an important thing. But when I think about what's next, I think looking forward, we must really prevent further hurdles that keep people from getting the help that they need. We need to really put an end to this failed idea of work requirements. There's decades of evidence showing they don't work. And certainly we need to stop expanding them. So when Congress considers the Farm Bill later this year, Senator Stabenow, who chairs the Senate Agriculture Committee, has also said, we are done on work and we are not going to consider any further work requirements to be added to the SNAP program. And then there will be decisions on those funding areas that I mentioned, everything from childcare to environmental protection, as specific spending bills are written later this year. And I think it's going to be really important for policymakers to protect the areas that, really safeguard the well-being of people who face difficulty meeting basic needs. We need to find a way to abolish the debt ceiling and end this absurd cycle of debt ceiling hostage taking. It distorts our democracy. It's not good for the country. It's not a good way for policymakers to come together to negotiate around really important decisions. That would really free us up, I think, to have the debate that we should be having about the country we want to be and the policy agenda that will help us get there. We should be talking about policies that would broaden opportunity, reduce hardship that so many people in the country endure, and would really ensure that everyone has the resources to afford the basic, like food, a roof overhead, and healthcare. So that's the debate I think we feel we should be having. We really need to move away from this, cycle of debt ceiling. So
Great.
I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. I want to ask Floyd Galloway to ask his question in the chat. Mr. Galloway.
Okay, I think I muted.
Floyd, thanks.
Thank you, Sandy. My question is, can President Biden sign an executive order to overcome some of the limitations of the deal that was just made? Say like some of the SNAP work requirements?
I think that's a good question. I think we always want to make sure we're looking at what an administration can do through the regulatory process to make requirements as, to make them less burdensome, to make them as easy for people to comply with, to try to, expand any exemptions that they're able to through the regulatory process. But I actually at a little bit of the limit of my expertise in terms of how much flexibility the president would have in this area. So
I think the only thing I would add, Shannon, is I can imagine, as has been done with past EOs, they're subject to legal challenges. So that could, I don't know where that would be, but we've seen EOs be stopped because of immediate legal challenges in the courts. But again, I'm not an attorney. I just used to work in the government.
Right.
But isn't that an option? I mean, even something that you could try, even if it does have to have some kind of legal challenges later.
Yeah, I think like it's definitely an important thing to explore what avenues are available to try to mitigate some of the harm of these new rules that will be in place, and would definitely encourage the administration to pursue options there.
Thank you.
I'm gonna go to our third speaker and then ask each of our guests if they have comments or questions to make of each other before we go to a final round of questions from our audience. So our third speaker is Lindsay Owens, Executive Director of Groundwork Collaborative, who will speak about the deal's cuts to the IRS budget, which were mentioned, but not, I think, what they really reveal about the deal's impact on working class people. I'm not restricting you to that topic, but it's a great segue to our first two speakers. Thank you, Lindsay.
Yeah, thanks, Sandy. Thanks for having me, and some really great questions popping up in the chat. Just wanted to address one of them, which I think is really spot on, which is the question of could we eliminate or suspend for longer periods of time the debt limit? And the answer is absolutely 100%. That's an option. There are a number of ways to square this. You can raise the spending levels by larger amounts that will get you through a longer period of time. You can suspend the limit for a longer period of time, and you can eliminate the debt limit altogether. Denmark is the only other democratic country in the world who deals with this. They deal with it better than we do, but we're really unique among nations in the use of a debt ceiling, and frankly in the the unique form of, I think, political malfunction that surrounds the debt ceiling. And so I would just want to say, I don't think there's any virtue in this bipartisan deal coming together a week before the X date. There's nothing for either party to be boasting about. There's no sort of glory in the fact that it is bipartisan. We should not be in a position where the American government is getting to, getting within a week of defaulting on its obligations. Remember, the debt ceiling isn't about future spending. It's about paying bills on spending that's already been incurred. So this lifting the debt ceiling has absolutely no bearing on fiscal matters moving forward. The reason that we're here today talking about the budget and talking about fiscal matters is actually mostly unrelated to the debt ceiling as a sort of structural matter, but rather because a contingent of Republicans in Congress insisted on tying a budget fight to the debt ceiling elimination, right? So the pairing of these two things is strictly artificial and strictly a political construction, not a requirement of lifting the debt ceiling. And so I think, there's really nothing for us to be proud of. We shouldn't be putting the American people in this position. Had a deal not come together, the consequences would have been extraordinary. I mean, Mark Zandi has estimated that between 7 and 8 million Americans would have lost their jobs had we defaulted on our debt for any period of time, and that up to $10 trillion in wealth would have been destroyed. So I think, we've lifted the debt ceiling in a bipartisan fashion without hostage taking and side deals dozens of times, and that would have been preferred here. Although I agree that there probably isn't the legislative support for passing a standalone piece of legislation to eliminate the debt ceiling, there are also administrative options, including, we heard a lot over the last few months about the potential invocation of the Biden administration of the 14th Amendment. And so I think that's worth folks knowing about and looking into as well. But I'll talk just briefly about an important part of the deal, the IRS funding. So as part of this debt limit deal, to kind of really soften the blow of the cuts to the non-defense discretionary programs that I think Shannon laid out really well. The Biden administration agreed to Republican demands to shave off about $21.4 billion in funding for the Internal Revenue Service. And for those who haven't been following this issue super closely, last year when Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, they allocated about $80 billion to the Internal Revenue Service over a 10-year window. And the goal of that funding was sort of to do a couple of things. One, to make sure that the IRS can hire the staff and build out the technological systems that are needed to really function effectively, to offer good levels of customer service, to help Americans file their taxes successfully. And, we're really already seeing the effects of that play out this past tax filing season. Call wait times were down about 85%, which is, just great for folks who don't have a lot of time to sit waiting on the phone with the IRS to figure out how to file their taxes and make sure they get the benefits that come through the tax code as well, things like the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. That funding was also meant to enable the IRS to start better enforcing the laws on the books to crack down on wealthy tax cheats and tax evaders. And we know that unfortunately, the top 1% of individual filers, the wealthiest 1% of individual filers, now make up about 70% of what we call the tax gap. That's the differences between taxes owed and taxes collected. And so that money was meant to provide the staffing and the capital and the resources to really start cracking down and auditing and enforcing the laws on the books so that the wealthy aren't continuously cheating on their taxes. So because that money would have resulted in better enforcement, actually the fact that we cut that $21.4 billion from IRS funding, we didn't save $21.4 billion. We actually lost $90 million because each dollar that is put forward for enforcement not only pays for itself, but actually brings in a little more than what's spent in revenue. And so I think it's really critical for folks to understand that despite the Republicans' top priority being budget cuts, this particular provision that they fought forcefully for actually results in a net increase to the deficit. And that's because it results in foregone revenue collection by the IRS. So that's just a really important piece of the deal that we haven't fully talked about. The other thing I'll say is, Shannon alluded to cuts to the non-defense discretionary budget, which is the sort of non-military spending side of the annual appropriations. And you may have heard in the press, you may have reported yourselves that there weren't cuts to the non-defense discretionary budget, that there was a freeze in the first fiscal year of the 2 fiscal year deal and a 1% increase in funds for the non-defense discretionary outlays in the second fiscal year of the 2-year deal. But Shannon is exactly right that actually the ultimate deal does result in cuts to non-defense discretionary spending. And one of the reasons why is because of inflation. So even though you freeze funding year over year, in a world in which inflation is 4 to 5%, inflation eats its share first, and then there are 5% less funds available to fund all of the programs that the NDD budget funds, whether that's 5% less housing assistance, 5% fewer slots for toddlers to go to Head Start, 5% fewer services for seniors. And so I think it's really important to understand that in a world in which we have rising inflation, which we're expected to have in fiscal year 2023 and fiscal year 2025, or sorry, 2024 and 2025, a flat funding or 1% funding increase won't actually cover and the effects of inflation. And so I think that's another important piece here. So with that, I think I'll pause, and I know we're getting towards the end, so maybe move back to questions, Sandy.
No, this is fascinating. It's like I never took economics when I was in college because I figured I didn't have the math. And now I realize just how deeply interwoven all of this information is to how our culture and society works. We have a question from Julian Doe, which sort of emanates from my remarks. And Julian, can you ask a very simple version of your rather complex question?
Yes, can anybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. So from a global perspective, high government debt is always occurring many disruptions. Even in Europe, we might recall what happened to Greece. And it's always ended up with a lot of cases that the IMF step in, and a lot of the austerity have been implemented. Now we're looking at the 2020 numbers. China's debt. China is the second largest economy, and its debt is at 137%. And the low income economies is the average 8%. But the US is really off the charts at 31 trillion, or nearly 300%, which is among the highest in the world. So on the one hand, we are preaching to other countries about establishing balanced budgets and keeping the debt low, but we are not doing it ourselves. So are we hurting ourselves? Is US economy is really like a house cards, and if it's collapsed, it would have a catastrophic global implication. Thank you.
So I'd like to ask each of our speakers to just very briefly comment on that. Rachel, let's start with you.
So sorry.
So the question really Julian is raising is, isn't the debt level really an indicator of the US economy sort of being almost like a house of cards? A real indicator that we, like other countries that have not fared well with high debt levels, could be deluding ourselves into believing Paul Krugman that deficits are not really the bane of our existence. I'm sorry.
I mean, no, I think it's an excellent point, but I also think that, we see that there are, I come from the perspective that, these rising debt levels do matter, because I think as we see year after year, there are costs associated with having these debates, but also the fact that, the share of the budget pie that's going to just servicing our debt costs is going to crowd out those other investment opportunities. I think what makes the United States, very different in this sense is that these are politically motivated discussions. I think as both Lindsay and Shannon alluded to, there's a way forward from this. We can reform the budget process. We can reform the debt limit process. Do we have the political courage to do so? I think that within that, though, we have to have the political courage to also get our fiscal house in order. And so, yes, certainly a political house of cards, but I think what's different is the fact that if we're going to leave the threat of default on the table, as the world's strongest economy, we're leaving default on the table for a purely political reason, not because we don't have access to the capital markets, which differentiates us from the, debt crises that we've seen in Greece and Argentina and Venezuela, for example.
Thank you. That's an important perspective. Shannon, any comment you want to make on Julian's question?
Sure. I would just say that I think we're not in a crisis. that there are issues we want to address over the long term, partly because, you know, our population is aging and there are rising costs that come along with that, and there are costs that we want to be prepared to meet to, you know, sort of deliver on commitments that we've made to people to have healthcare, to have enough money to afford the basics. And any, you know, serious approach that looks at our long-term fiscal picture just has to include revenues. It's, you know, you can't have that conversation without looking at the revenue side of the equation. And I think it's really difficult when you know, we're in a situation where there's a political party that won't do that. So that's a real obstacle, but a serious approach to deficits has to include it and should focus both on, you know, boosting economic growth and expanding opportunity.
Thank you. And Lindsay, you've commented that the debt crisis is an entirely manufactured, in a way, political distraction or political initiative. How would you respond to Julian's question?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I mean, I do think the fact that you know, our political system is turning debt into a crisis is worrisome. But in terms of how debt impacts the economy, you know, we just don't really have evidence, you know, good economic evidence suggesting that the current debt to GDP ratio, you know, is a problem for the U.S. economy. And in fact, I think if you look at, you know, the totality of indicators that you might want to consider in judging what makes up a healthy economy, you know, the data looks pretty good on that front. We just saw this morning, you know, 339,000 jobs have been created this month, and you know, the U.S. unemployment rate is in the mid 3% range. The unemployment rate for Black Americans is, you know, at a 50-year low. So we have a really, really strong labor market right now. You know, if I had to pick what our big economic threats are, you know, debt wouldn't be in my top 10 list. Things like the fact that we've done 10 interest rate hikes in a little over a year, which is, you know, quite aggressive out of the Federal Reserve. I think that is jeopardizing our economic strength. I think, you know, as Shannon pointed out, like the fact that, you know, our tax code is as lopsided as it is, I think really undermines our economy and our democracy. I also think, you know, the spending that has happened over the last year, I mean, it's worth thinking about what you're spending money on and how that influences the debt and the deficit. Not every dollar of debt is created equally. So the spending that was done to get Americans through the pandemic, you know, more than paid for itself, right? We got through the pandemic, we kept our economy online, we kept GDP growing, we brought workers back into the fold. The long-term spending that the Biden administration put forward last year, by the way, much of which was bipartisan. So I don't think, you know, the only opportunity for bipartisan alignment is on, you know, is on a terrible fiscal deal attached to a debt ceiling catastrophe. We did a manufacturing bill on a bipartisan basis. We did an infrastructure bill on a bipartisan basis. We also passed, you know, major investments in climate legislation. And what we're seeing, and I think this is really important, what we're seeing is those government's expenditures are not wasteful at all. They're not actually undermining the strength of our economy. Quite the opposite. They're strengthening our position. They're enhancing productivity. And most importantly of all, they're actually crowding in more investment from the private sector. And so we're actually in a position now where the spending the government is doing is bringing other people online. So the long-term, I think the long-term spending that we've seen over the last couple of years has actually been really economy strengthening and economy enhancing. And that's why we're looking at such a strong labor market. But I think, you know, the thing that has been really racking up the debt is not those expenditures. It is rather, you know, tax cuts over the last decade, particularly the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that Trump and the Republicans ushered in. And so I think thinking about the causes of the underlying increase in debt and deficits is important too. But the U.S. economy is pretty stable. I mean, the other X factor, of course, being the banking sector. We've had a couple of reasonably large bank failures in the last 60 days. But again, that doesn't have anything to do with the debt to GDP ratio.
Great. We have a question from Pedro Gratterol, who is which is very relevant to this comment. Pedro, do you want to ask your question? And Rachel, you had a very good response. Maybe you want to take on a response.
Sure. I'm sorry, I've been jumping all over the chat, so that's why I've been.
Can you hear me okay?
Pedro, can you ask your question?
Yes, absolutely. So debt ceiling showdowns are becoming increasingly common in the United States. There was a huge one in 2011 with the Tea Party under the President Obama. We had one in 2021, this one that was awfully close to a default. And I was wondering your perspective on how that impacts the trust that government bondholders, sorry, I don't know why I wrote shareholders, and other foreign currencies have, because many currencies around the world have their reserves in dollars. So if there's a default, like what would be the implications of that? Thank you.
Yeah, so we've seen, I think it's an excellent question, because I think that we've seen repeated showdowns. Like, this is the cost of political brinkmanship over the debt limit. So before we're even talking about default, we're seeing a reflection of increased risk aversion among global investors and holding and buying our debt through the increased yields that they demand on Treasury securities. So those increased yields only drive up our costs to borrow, but those are then paid for by taxpayers. I think what's really important too is if we're kind of thinking in a situation where we were to default and there is a rapid decrease in potentially demand for U.S. securities, I think the entire Treasury auction system that really upholds this, these global investments, global investors could find themselves in a situation where they weren't going to be paid. And so, I think that from a that's really where you start to see some of these massive contagion effects that could happen across the global economy, if we were to default, but also even before that, if we were to see, yields rise so tremendously and a decrease in demand for holding U.S. Treasury securities plummet so significantly that we were, potentially facing a failed Treasury auction. The other thing I would note is that, all of these could lead to a massive decrease in the value of the dollar, which for those emerging economies that have a large amount of their debt held in other currencies, those would immediately rise. And so their debt overnight would become much more expensive to hold and to pay back. And so I think that we have to really see this through the lens of these multiple ripple effects that could happen. It would really be hard to kind of contain with those impacts. I think it's an excellent question, and it is also where we know that ratings agencies, Fitch, S&P have been looking a lot at what's going on in the Treasury securities market and trying to understand kind of the risk appetite of global investors, particularly to your point.
Okay, we have 60 seconds left, and I'd like each of you to take about 15, 20 seconds. What, for us as journalists, for us as ethnic media producers, what would you most like to see us cover from this briefing on the debt ceiling crisis and how to make sense out of it? What's the most important point you want to have us take away? And let's start with Shannon, because it's great when you zoom in and tell us about TANF, tell us about SNAP, tell us about IRS, and will cuts be good news for Black Americans, which get audited at multiple times more than other groups? So what's your takeaway? What would you like to see the headline or the lead of our coverage be?
Well, one thing I think is great about this group of reporters is really focusing on the real life impact that these kinds of decisions have on people, on real people. And so I think the thing I'd love for folks to take away is not the sort of gamesmanship and the politics and the sort of who won and who lost in Washington, but what are the real implications for people across the country and their day-to-day lives? And I feel like that's the important way to judge this agreement.
Terrific. Rachel, what would you want to see us take away?
I agree. I mean, I think that it's so many of the question, and I think Seema, you brought this up so eloquently in your points, is that this all comes back down to the voter, right? And that all politics is local. And I think that we can so easily get lost in this debate of these macro elements, but we have to really remember that it's who we send to Washington to represent our core values, and that, you know, they have a job to do to reflect those values from back home. So I think it's all about making it local and personal, which is what you all are doing in your work.
Thank you. And Lindsay, you get the final shout out for us, call to action for us as journalists.
Yeah, I would just say it's important not to forget to cover, you know, a critical piece of the story, which is that, you know, not a single dollar was raised from the wealthier corporations in this debt ceiling deal. And all of the downside in this deal, all of the spending cuts this deal did usher in to sort of ostensibly reduce the deficit, you know, were the results of, you know, punitive measures affecting the most vulnerable communities, you know, kicking 50-year-olds off nutrition assistance. And I think, you know, the US has got to reconcile, you know, the politics of taxing wealthy corporations, or we're going to keep, you know, kicking older Americans in the teeth every 2 years when we deal with one of these debt ceiling deals.
I can't thank you three enough for taking time out on a Friday after a long week and sharing your expertise with us. We see these briefings as real opportunities to expand sources for all of us as reporters. And I can think of no more complicated topic than the economy and finances, although the pandemic struck us as also a huge learning curve in medical science. So we're very happy to welcome you to be valued sources for us moving forward. And we will send a list of all participants to each of you and hope you will also include us in your press releases moving forward. You've been great speakers, and we're happy to bring our sector together with your expertise. Thank you so much. Conference is now closed.